Detroit is a city that never stops fighting for its future. A city built by dreamers, makers, and families who shaped America with their hands. Over the years, Detroit has seen unbelievable highs and painful lows, booming factories, empty streets, proud neighborhoods, and powerful comebacks. But through it all, one thing never changed: the spirit of the people who call this place home. Today, we're taking a journey through time. We'll look back at how some of Detroit's most iconic places looked in the year 1960 and how they stand today in 2025. Some have risen again. Some are still rebuilding. All of them hold pieces of Detroit's story. So sit back, relax, and let's step into the heart of a city that refuses to stay down. This is Detroit Then and Now. Before we begin, if you enjoy learning about cities and their history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you more then and now stories from across America. All right, let's start our journey through Detroit. Number 1, Michigan Central Station. Few buildings in Detroit carry a story as powerful as Michigan Central Station. It was once a symbol of decline, and now, after decades of silence, it rises again with fresh purpose. Then, in the year 1960. Back in the year 1960, Michigan Central Station still had the bones of greatness, but its glory was fading fast. The massive waiting hall echoed with footsteps that grew fewer each year. Train routes were shutting down, and the rail era that had built Detroit was slowly dying. Outside, Corktown struggled with factory layoffs and population loss. The station, once full of life, stood at the edge of an uncertain future, quietly slipping away from the city's memory. Now in the year 2025, today, the station is alive again. Ford's restoration has turned it into a global tech and mobility hub. At night, its windows glow like a revived cathedral, pulling people back into Corktown streets. Families stroll by, workers enter with purpose, and new businesses grow around it. Where silence once lived, voices, lights, and hope fill the air. Detroit reclaimed one of its greatest landmarks and gave it a new mission. From the station, we follow the river east, where Detroit has transformed its edges into one of the most beautiful waterfronts in America. Number 2, Detroit Riverfront Renaissance Center. The Detroit Riverfront is proof that a city can rewrite its own story. What was once a stretch of aging industry has become a shining front porch for the entire region. Then in the year 1960, the riverfront wasn't a place people visited for fun. Warehouses, parking lots, and concrete barriers lined the water. The river worked for shipping, not for families. There were no long walking paths, no plazas, no inviting green spaces. The skyline was lower, and the Renaissance Center had not yet risen. It was a working zone, functional, but far from beautiful. Now in the year 2025, today, the Riverwalk is award-winning and filled with color. People bike, jog, and take slow evening walks along the water. The Renaissance Center stands tall in mirrored glass, reflecting sunsets across the river. Parks, art pieces, playgrounds, cafes, and open spaces stretch for miles along the shoreline. What was once industrial land is now one of Detroit's brightest treasures. Just a short distance inland sits a neighborhood that has experienced one of Detroit's most dramatic rebirths: Brush Park. Number 3, Brush Park. Brush Park shows what happens when history refuses to die. Its mansions survive decay, fires, and empty years, and now they shine beside modern life. Then in the year 1960, during the 1960, Brush Park's Victorian homes were aging badly. What were once grand houses had peeling paint, collapsed porches, and overgrown yards. Families moved to the suburbs, leaving empty streets behind. Vacant lots replaced beautiful architecture. The neighborhood felt frozen in decline, its former elegance buried under decades of hardship. Now in the year 2025, today, Brush Park is one of Detroit's most stylish neighborhoods. Restored mansions stand proudly beside modern townhomes and apartments. New restaurants and cafes bring people out at all hours. The area connects smoothly to Midtown, Little Caesars Arena, and downtown. The streets feel young again, full of walkers, cyclists, and energy. It is a living example of Detroit's resilience. And just to the west, Detroit's oldest neighborhood tells a similar story: Corktown. Number 4, Corktown. Corktown is where Detroit's past meets its future. The city's oldest surviving neighborhood has transformed from worn-out streets to one of the trendiest areas in town. Then, in the year 1960, Corktown was quiet and aging. Irish families who once filled the streets had mostly moved on. Businesses along Michigan Avenue struggled, and many storefronts went dark. The beautiful old brick homes stood, but with fading charm. The neighborhood felt forgotten, holding on to history while everything around it changed. Now in the year 2025, today, Corktown pulses with life. Michigan Avenue is lined with restaurants, cafes, breweries, and creative shops. Families, students, and young professionals fill new apartments and renovated lofts. The revival of Michigan Central Station pushed fresh energy through the neighborhood. Corktown is now a mix of old character and modern excitement. The thread of Detroit's story continues along its most famous street, Woodward Avenue. Number 5, Woodward Avenue. Woodward Avenue has witnessed every chapter of Detroit's rise, fall, and rise again. It remains the spine of the city's identity. Then in the year 1960, Woodward was busy, bright, and full of shops. But as the decade moved on, things changed. Streetcars disappeared, businesses closed or moved out. Crowds grew thin, especially after dark. The road that once felt like the city's main stage began to lose its shine. Now in the year 2025, today, Woodward is alive again. The Q line brings streetcars back to the avenue. New towers, renovated theaters, sports arenas, and stores fill the corridor. Thousands gather for concerts, markets, and events. Campus Martius sits at its center, pulling the whole city together. Woodward has rediscovered its purpose. North of downtown, Detroit's island getaway continues its own journey of renewal, Belle Isle. Number 6, Belle Isle. Belle Isle has seen Detroit at its best and worst. Through it all, the island has remained a place of peace, escape, and now, rebirth. Then in the year 1960, during the 1960s, Belle Isle was loved but slowly aging. The aquarium and conservatory needed care. Roads cracked, and some picnic areas wore down from years of heavy use. Families still visited, but the island showed signs of neglect. Nature began reclaiming parts that weren't maintained. Now, 2025. Today, Belle Isle is cleaner, brighter, and more vibrant. The conservatory and aquarium have been restored. Trails attract joggers, cyclists, and families. Events fill weekends with music and celebrations. The views of the Detroit skyline are breathtaking. Belle Isle feels like a renewed sanctuary for the entire city. But not every place has returned to glory. Some carry heavier stories like the Packard Plant. Number 7, Packard Automotive Plant. The Packard Plant stands as one of Detroit's most haunting reminders of industrial decline and one of its biggest opportunities for rebirth. Then 1960. By the 1960s, the Packard Plant was already empty. The once bustling factory had stopped producing cars years earlier. Machines sat silent, windows shattered, and halls collected dust. Grass and graffiti crept into the ruins. It became a symbol of the city's disappearing manufacturing jobs and population loss. Now 2025. Today, large sections have been cleared for redevelopment. Some buildings have been demolished, while others host small businesses, art events, and community projects. The land is slowly being reshaped into mixed-use spaces and potential innovation hubs. The area still carries scars, but signs of revival are growing. Just a few miles away, another Detroit landmark has taken a different path, one filled with food, culture, and color. Eastern Market. Number 8, Eastern Market. Eastern Market has always fed Detroit, first with food, now with energy, culture, and life. Then 1960. In the 1960s, Eastern Market was bustling with trucks, farmers, and butchers. It was practical and busy, but plain. The sheds were crowded and functional without the art and entertainment seen today. The area was surrounded by warehouses and small shops, serving mostly local shoppers. It was useful, but not yet vibrant. Now, 2025. Today, Eastern Market is a landmark of creativity and community. Murals cover nearly every wall. Saturdays bring thousands of people for food, music, and events. New restaurants, cafes, breweries, and studios fill the surrounding blocks. It remains Detroit's oldest market, but now it is one of the city's cultural hotspots. Just south of here sits a place that went from concrete to community, Campus Martius Park. Number 9, Campus Martius Park. Campus Martius proves that a single space can change an entire downtown. The 1960. In the 1960s, this area was nothing more than busy traffic lanes. There were no lawns, no cafes, no ice rink, and no events. People walked through, not to it. The heart of Detroit's downtown felt empty after work hours. It lacked the warm, welcoming feel of a true city center. Now 2025. Today, Campus Martius is the city's living room. Green spaces, outdoor dining, concerts, and seasonal events bring constant life. Winter ice skating, summer festivals, and everyday meetups all happen here. Office workers, families, and visitors gather day and night. It is now one of the most beloved urban parks in the country. And just a few miles up, Woodward stands one of Detroit's greatest architectural masterpieces, the Fisher Building. Number 10, Fisher Building. The Fisher Building has always been beautiful, but Detroit's comeback has made it shine even brighter. Then 1960. During the 1960s, the Fisher Building remained elegant, but the surrounding area struggled. The theater stayed open, yet some offices sat empty. Many nearby buildings were demolished for parking lots. The gold-trimmed interior dimmed under decades of wear. New Center felt quieter and less lively. Now 2025. Today, the Fisher Building is fully restored and filled with activity. New shops, restaurants, and events bring new faces daily. The theater draws crowds for concerts and shows. Nearby developments have added apartments, businesses, and energy to New Center. The Fisher Building stands again as a bright, proud symbol of Detroit's strength. Detroit's story is not perfect, and it has never been easy. But every place we visited today, every station, street, market, riverfront, and neighborhood shows the same powerful truth. This city always finds a way to rise again. The buildings may change, the roads may shift, and the years may pass, but the heart of Detroit stays the same, strong, resilient, unbreakable. If you enjoyed this journey through Detroit's past and present, please subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who loves history. Your support helps us keep creating more then and now stories just like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next city.